Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our in-house recruitment and Brookson legal webinar. We are talking around IR35 and your sort of flexible workforce today. So I am joined by the lovely Matt, Paul, and Alison. So thank you very much to you guys for joining us. Matt and Paul are from Brookson Legal, and Alison will be talking us through some of her sort of challenges and focuses at the end of the session. She's from DXC Technology. So she'll be talking us through a little bit of a case study, which is always quite interesting for you guys as well, understanding how it works in the real world. For those of you who don't know who Brookson Legal are, and I'm sure you guys have guessed it, they are an SRA regulated law firm providing a range of IR35 solutions to the flexible working supply chain. So these guys are going to talk you through some of what they do, just for a little bit of context, but they are mainly here to provide insight and give you guidance on what you need to do in preparation for IR35 coming in on the 6th of April 2021, which I'm sure you all know in any case. So before we get started, I will be handing over to Paul very shortly. If you do have any questions, feel free to pop in the Q&A box down the bottom. You should be able to just type your answer in there. Feel free to ask it at any point throughout the session. And what we'll do is at the end of Paul, Matt and Alison's session, probably around 11:15, we'll go and ask those questions. You can like questions, you can vote, and you can comment on questions as well. So if there's a question that's already been asked that you also want to know the answer to, pop a little like button on there and it will go to the top for me to ask these guys. We will be running polls throughout the session as well, so please do get involved. Let us know what's going on from your side. It just gives us some nice perspective to understand kind of what is going on in the market. And as I said, without having those touch points at the face-to-face events at the moment, it's a little bit harder to do. So the more interactive, the more engaged that you guys are, the better the session will be for everyone. So that's it from me. Sorry, we are recording, so do feel free to, if you have any issues or want to share this session with people afterwards, we will be recording it and sending it out to you post-event in any case. But that is it from me. I'm sure you want to get stuck into IR35 and the challenges and opportunities that they bring. So I will hand over to Paul, I think it is, at starting next. So over to you, Paul. I'll make sure that you can turn your slides on and then I'll run away.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. Hopefully you can see the slides okay there. Thanks very much for the introduction, Natasha. I'm Paul Lloyd. I'm the Group Sales Director for Brookson. We're going to talk to you around how you can re-engineer your flexible workforce strategy and how you have an effective IR35 response. Like Natasha said, if you've got any questions throughout, please feel free to ask and be as interactive as you want. The agenda for today, we're going to give you a little bit of an overview about us, just so you know who we are. We're going to talk about some market reaction to IR35 and different pieces of legislation that have affected the contingent or flexible workforce over the last kind of 20 years. We're going to give you an IR35 overview and talk to you around why IR35 was originally brought in, what the changes are and when they come into effect, and then how you need to be preparing for the changes that come into effect now in 6 months in April 21. And talk to you a little bit about how we can help you. And then Alison's, one of our clients, has very kindly decided to join us today and talk around how DXC have managed IR35. We were helping them at the back end of 2019 and start of 2020, and then obviously now with the delayed changes as well. So a little bit about Brookson. Brookson now have been operating within the flexible workforce supply chain for 25 years. And the support that we provide runs right the way through from end hirers that look to hire contingent workers, right the way through the recruitment supply chain, helping recruitment agencies, and all the way down to providing flexible payment solutions for contractors. So as part of the group, we have an accountancy, an umbrella, and a payroll solutions provider for contractors, ensuring that they work in the correct way, whether that be through an umbrella PAYE solution or through an accountancy service where they're working through their own personal services company. To support them through that, Brookson Legal Services, our SRA regulated law firm, specialises in IR35 and has been now advising on IR35 since the legislation's inception in 2000. So over that 20 years, we've been advising contractors predominantly for the first 17 years, while the liability and responsibility sat with them. And then we've now started to help end hirers of all shapes and sizes over the last 3 to 4 years as that legislation moves up the supply chain in the public and now the private sector. We also offer financial advice to contractors, making sure that they can get the best deal for their mortgages, investments, pensions, and offering a full solution for contractors and giving them the correct advice. And then, as you'll see throughout the presentation, we offer a range of solutions right the way throughout that supply chain, offering to minimise risk, advise on legislation, and making sure that our clients are getting the best possible advice. So the main areas of Brookson that we'll talk to you about today: Brookson 1, we're a founding member of the the FCSA, which is the Freelancer and Contractor Services Association, which is the kind of shining light for compliance within our sector and making sure that we all adhere to the code of conduct and that all the compliance and legislation is adhered to. We brought the first IR35 employment status test to market back in 2000 through Brookson Legal Services, and we currently work with over 15,000 PSCs, helping them with their accountancy and advising them on this legislation. And we offer compliance solutions to remove the risk for the entire supply chain for you, including fee payer solutions that completely mitigate the risk and liability of IR35. As I mentioned, Brookson Legal has been advising on the legislation for 20 years in different guises now, from when we are advising contractors when the liability is with them, right the way through to now where the legislation is moving and it's becoming the end hirer's responsibility. We've got vast experience in the public and the private sector changes, and Matt will take you through some of the help that we've given those types of clients. And we are a law firm that's regulated by the Solicitors Regulation Authority. So the advice that we give is protected by the professional indemnity insurance. And as you'll see later, we do this through a unique blend of technology and legal advice, where there's lots of different solutions in the marketplace. We found a way of blending a seamless technology up front with the expert legal advice and consultancy service at the back end. And through part of our group, plus us, we're currently engaged with over 30 NHS trusts, making sure that we can supply them with technology and a service that delivers compliance savings, that manages their IR35 and criminal finance at risk, and provides them that technology to be able to see the end-to-end supply chain and making sure there's visibility on all of the compliance solutions for them. A little about how our solutions work at the moment. The first point of call in terms of when you're looking to hire contractors in the future will be that you'll need to decide on the status determination status for the IR35 status of that contractor. And we can create advice and consultation and create that status determination statement for you. We can offer technology that allows vacancy creation and distribution through to supplier management. And then obviously your agencies or your in-house teams are there to make sure that they're sourcing and selecting the right candidates and that the compliance and onboarding checks are all done. We then have systems that help with invoicing, payment, and client and candidate offboarding as necessary. And the whole purpose around this is to make sure that you comply with the legislation and have visibility of that whole supply chain, making sure that you can still hire the contractors that you need, even though the legislation is changing. So the first poll question that we've got here, Natasha's going to pop this up on the screen for you, if you wouldn't mind responding to the first question. So the first one there is, has your business commenced its project to prepare for the IR35 changes in April 21? If you wouldn't mind answering that on screen, and then we can share some results with you. I think what we found was that businesses start preparing at different times. When the legislation was delayed early this year, some businesses started as early as the summer of 2019, where some were still trying to prepare in February and March of 2020.
I'll just give it another 10-15 seconds just to get as many votes as possible for you. If you can't see the poll, it might be because you're on the browser option. But if you can just pop in the chat if you have started, if you haven't started, or if you don't know. So yes, no, or don't know will just give us some additional context, would be great. Okay. Right.
Okay, thank you very much. Hopefully you've managed to answer that through either the question box or through the chat box or through the poll there, and we can see the results on the screen. So the majority of you have now have started to prepare, only 11% not so far, and only 3% of you are unsure on the process that you're up to so far. So I'm going to hand you over now to Matt Fryer, who's our Group Compliance Director and Head of our Legal Services business, and he's going to take you through the next couple of parts of the agenda. Thanks, Matt.
Thanks, Paul. Good morning, everybody. My name is Matt Fryer. I'm Group Compliance Director at Brookson and also head up our legal services business. So my role is to make sure that we understand the legislation and we translate that into practical and commercial advice and solutions for our clients. It's interesting to see that 86% of you have commenced your project. That's really good to hear. I think this time last year there was quite a lot of inertia in the market, people unsure whether legislation was going to go through or not. I think we've now got that certainty, and it's good to see that people are starting those projects. 6 months to go, hang on today. So I think the webinar's timed well. 6 months is a decent amount of time to get things right. And if you're already made a head start on that, I think you're in a good position. Just pop on to the next slide, please, Paul. So I think before we get into the detail around the change, I just wanted to have a quick look at the flexible labour market in the UK. And we can see here, it's pretty clear from this graph that it's growing and it's continuing to grow. It is now a significant part. I think it's 16 or 17% of the UK's workforce is now self-employed in some way or other, whether that's an agency temp, a self-employed sole trader, or a PSC contractor. And I think we can see here that there's probably a mindset of individuals that they now want to be self-employed. And we'll see a growing trend in organisations wanting to use resource rather than own that resource. And I think that flexibility is one of the positives in the UK labour market. And it's highlighted as one of the reasons why our labour market is so productive. Just jump on, yeah, so we've now overlaid some key legislative changes that have impacted the flexible labour market over the last 20 years. The key one there clearly is IR35 back in 2000, and then every 3 or 4 years there's been additional pieces of legislation that have dropped in there. I think 2 key points from this chart is that doesn't seem to have stifled growth in the flexible economy, but also the majority, if not all of those legislative changes have been ones that have impacted your supply chain more than you directly perhaps. So lots of these are targeted at agencies and umbrella companies and other payment intermediaries. Obviously, the change that we're going to see in April 21 is probably the first one that directly impacts the end user of that contractor business. You can see there in 2017, we had the IR35 public sector changes, and you can see a slight dip in the use of contractors in the market. And that was, I'll touch on why when we look at learnings from the public sector, but very clearly there was a bounce back beyond that. So I think when we talk about using this as an opportunity, we know the flexible labour market is growing. There's more people in the market that want to work flexibly. So if you as a business are able to embrace and support that, I think you've got an opportunity to get the best talent and retain the best talent, because there are others in the market that will perhaps knee-jerk and take a overtly risk-based, purely tax decision and not want to use the flexible labour market for a period of time, or certainly try to push people into payroll models when perhaps it's not felt that that's fair for the individual. So there are opportunities to take from this, and we'll touch on some of those as we go through the slides. So overview of IR35. What is IR35? I've mentioned before it came in 2000. Originally, it was meant to be the end user of the contractor that was responsible for the risk, but there was lots of lobbying, predominantly from CBI, and the decision was made to put that risk and responsibility onto the individual contractor and their personal service company. The reason it was originally introduced was back in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was a growing tendency for employees to resign for their employment and come back working for the same employer, doing exactly the same job, but now working through a limited company. And they did that because corporation tax rates are much lower than employment tax rates, and there's no employer's national insurance associated to you buying a service from a company. So that was deemed by Treasury as a big risk. Obviously, there was a dent in the Treasury's coffers, and IR35 was brought in. And the basis behind the legislation is, if somebody is acting in a way that looks like employment, then tax should be paid into employment. So the key tests really are more enshrined in case law than in legislation. But what essentially IR35 looked at is it an employment relationship or not? And case law tells us that there's 3 key tests to do that. The first one being, is it the personal service of an individual that's required? If it is, then that's more of an employment relationship. If there's flexibility in terms of who provides that service, you may well have the preferred service provider named, but if there's an ability to substitute or for them to provide an alternative individual if they can't make project or off sick or they're too busy, that's called the right of substitution. If that's there, then it proves that it's not the personal service of the individual and points towards being self-employment. That's the first key test. Second test looks around control. So how do you control that individual or that service provider? If you have a high level of control over what they have to do, where they have to do it, when they have to do it, and perhaps more crucially, how they go about delivering the project, then that looks like an employment relationship. So if they have a line manager or they have to regularly report into somebody who instructs them on how they should be going about the project, that would point towards an employment relationship. If, however, they're left to get on and deliver a project and use their own skill and experience to do that, by all means, project check-ins are fine. But if there's a lesser degree of control, that points away from employment. And the third test is one called mutuality of obligation. So in an employment relationship, there's obligations on both parties to continue to offer and pay for work and to continue to accept and deliver that work. If a project has got a fixed end date with a relatively short notice period, that points away from being employment and indicates a lack of mutuality of obligation. So they're the 3 key tests that IR35 is based on. Those tests aren't changing as we move through April 21. And the crucial thing to remember is if any one of those 3 key indicators isn't present, it cannot be employment and therefore it cannot be inside IR35. So it's actually quite a high threshold for HMRC to argue. I think that's just worth bearing in mind when we think about the risk. Just reflecting back a little bit on some of the numbers here. If we look back to April 2000, HMRC expected to be raising around £300 million a year from the introduction of the changes. Reports that we've seen spanning April 2020 to April 2018 show that actually their enforcement activity only raised £9.2 million. So we've had around 10 years now of the current legislation being heavily criticised. The House of Lords particularly criticised HMRC for lack of policing. HMRC put their hands up and said, we haven't got the resource to do this, so we're going to change it. And they're going to change it by a term they use quite frequently now, upstreaming compliance. They don't want to have to manage 650,000 personal service companies. They want to put that risk right at the head of that supply chain and manage tens of thousands of companies rather than hundreds of thousands of individuals. So that's the strategy behind the policy change that's driving the IR35 changes. And the Treasury have put a figure of £1.3 billion a year of estimated additional revenue, predominantly employers' national insurance that they're going to generate from this. So we did get a dry run of this in the public sector. At that point, the public sector had little time to react. So hirers were unprepared. We saw lots of blanket bans, non-compliance introduced in the supply chain, employment rights concerns. So individuals deemed to be taxed to be employees for tax purposes, but not receiving any employment rights. We've seen some claims for holiday pay that are going through the employment tribunal now. The concept of reasonable care was introduced, but not properly defined. And ultimately, there was a loss of skilled, flexible workers from predominantly public sector into private sector, but also those public sector organisations that quickly got up to speed with this and introduced the correct processes and dealt with it in a fair and reasonable manner. They benefited from that flight of contractors away from the public sectors that put in the blanket bans. Positive from that is we've had a dry run for the change that we're going to see in April 21. So just move on to poll question 2, if you could flash that one up, Natasha. Just be interesting to get the views on anyone who is intending to ban personal service companies from the supply chain or indicate that all PSCs are within IR35.
Again, if you can't see the poll, feel free to just pop a yes, no, or don't know in the chat box, and that just gives us a little bit more indication, even though it won't come up on the actual stats when we release them. Give it another 10, 15 seconds.
This is potentially a controversial question. I think this is an anonymous poll, isn't it, Natasha?
It is anonymous, yeah, so feel free to say what you'd like. We have had someone saying some of our end clients have already put black blanket bans on in any case, which is interesting. There is definitely people that are doing it. So, okay, I'll end that polling now. So you should be able to see the results.
Okay. That's a pleasing result. Clearly you guys are ahead of the curve. You've already started your projects and you're using the time to do this properly. So that's good to see, good to hear. So what's changing? Implementation date, as we mentioned before, it's 6 months from today, 6th of April 2021. I can't see that moving again. That now has received royal assent, so that is law. New law would need to be passed to delay it further. And the Chancellor has already indicated that there's not going to be a budget this year, so there's no legal mechanism to introduce new primary legislation. So it's going to be very hard for it to be delayed. Potentially it could still. I think we're in unprecedented times at the moment, lots of new laws coming out. But if we just think back to the £1.3 billion the Treasury have banked on, they need every penny they need at the moment. So I think any work that's completed after the 6th of April 21 will be subject to these new rules. And essentially what we're seeing here is a movement of risk and responsibility. So new responsibilities for you guys. Got to produce a status determination statement, which indicates whether the contract is inside or outside of IR35. It details why you think that's the case, and it needs to be communicated to the agency and the worker. And the crucial point here, it needs to be prepared with reasonable care. And I'll look at what that means in a second. But reasonable care is the key phrase for you to take away today, and the key threshold for you to make sure you hit. If you do that, then you don't need to worry about the taxman. There's some issues in this around liability flow through the supply chain. So if you have an agency in there that decides to ignore your status decision and goes against that and pays the worker, and they subsequently go bust, an ability for HMRC to come to you for any unpaid tax. So as well as getting your head around IR35 and the reasonable care point, you really need to start digging into that supply chain to make sure that you can do all you can to drive compliance through there. We've got hire-led challenge process associated to the legislation. So when you issue the SDS, you should be communicating your process by which contractors can challenge the status decision. It's really worth thinking about how you want that challenge process to work. Where do you want the challenges to come into, and how are you going to mediate? We did see big issues in the public sector, even to the extent that some individuals went 12 months without receiving payment because they were adamant that they could overturn the end hire status decision. So it really blends into your communication strategy here. And the last thing you want to do is issue an SDS to somebody who didn't know it was coming, didn't know the process you'd gone through, and hadn't been engaged through your own internal processes. Reasonable care we'll look at in a second. And it's also worth flagging the small company exemption. So if your company has fewer than 50 employees, less than £10 million turnover, and the balance sheet value is less than 5 million, then you're exempt from this change, and the legislation stays as it is, with the risk being on the contractor. I'm not sure that's relevant for many on this webinar, but it's always worth flagging. In terms of challenges, the 4 key points we've seen, certainly from the clients we've helped, is assessing the workforce and taking reasonable care. That's the obvious one. But when you step back from that, how do you know how many PSCs are in your workforce? How do you know the impacted population? that seems to be a bit of a challenge. Communicating with supply chain, you're probably getting agencies speaking to you now, trying to support you. Some agencies may not be doing that. I think the proactive ones are trying to help, which is good of them. But I think always remember, this is your risk, your responsibility. So you should be driving the process, and your supply chain should be adapting to what you're asking them to do. Aligned with that is the supply chain compliance point we made before, and that's around visibility of payment to workers. And the big one, how do you deal with contractors inside IR35? Broad brush, around a 25% take-home pay reduction for any contractors who you deem to be inside of IR35. The interesting discussion there is, well, have they actually applied the rules correctly? Should they have been paying that 25% tax in the past? So we will see some disgruntled contractors. We will see some challenges, but for me, this is about getting the comms process right. So penultimate poll, question 3. Just to gauge what the key challenges you guys are facing in terms of your projects.
If you can't see the poll, it would be great to just have it on chat. But some of the challenges that we've listed are identifying the contractors, undertaking the IR35 assessment, ensuring compliance, and managing contractor reaction to inside IR35 assessment. So there might be other ones as well. I'm sure there's an array of challenges that you're facing, so feel free to pop them in the chat box whilst we go through this.
Yeah, just while we're waiting for that, I've got a question here around what do contractors know about this? I would as well be amazed if a contractor wasn't aware of this rule change. I know agencies have been working hard for 18 months. Brookson's accountancy business has certainly been working very hard about educating our clients. The trade bodies are doing that. So I'd be gobsmacked if contractors, genuine contractors, were unaware of this. I think if a contractor is not aware of the change, I'd step back and think, do they actually understand what they're doing? Do they understand they're a PSC? Do they understand that they had a risk to manage themselves? You know, maybe they are one of those disguised employees.
Okay, you should see the results online now as well. Okay,
great. Yeah, it's good to see identifying contractors isn't as big an issue. And yeah, as I expected, undertaking the assessment is the new thing that you guys need to get your heads around. Okay, so move on to reasonable care. I've got a separate slide on this one, because I think this really is the crucial threshold for you to get your heads around. It's never really been defined, but earlier on this year, HMRC published some useful guidance around what reasonable care is. The starting position is that the threshold basically flexes by the size of the business. If you're a big organisation with lots of human resource and lots of financial resource, then you've got to work really hard to make sure you get this right. If you're a smaller business, they'll perhaps perceive a slightly lower threshold. There is useful guidance now on HMRC's website in plain English that you can find and see around reasonable care. It's very clear in there that seeking the advice of a professional advisor indicates reasonable care has been taken. If you choose to do this in-house yourselves and using CEST, if you don't understand the questions, you don't understand the reasoning behind the questions, and you haven't read HMRC's guidance, then you've used their tool, but you haven't met the reasonable care threshold. So that really is something for you to understand and apply to your project, just to make sure that you're ticking that box. You can see on the right-hand side, my view of CEST isn't particularly great. Lots of decisions can't be determined, and it omits one key element of the case law. It's starting to bear fruit now in the public sector. We've got NHS Digital, they use CEST. They've now got a £4.3 million tax bill that they're defending with HMRC. So HMRC are even challenging people that have used their own tool. So just be wary if that's the route that you are going down. It's not the be all and end all to this. Just move on one sec. Final question. just be interested to see how many people are currently using the CEST tool as their way of making that decision. Question here around CEST. CEST has been changed once already. There's lots of lobbying to say it still emits mutuality of obligation. HMRC haven't indicated there's going to be an update to CEST, but I think it needs one. But I certainly want to keep an eye on.
We'll give it another 10 seconds or so.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point from Karina there. This is, in our view, this is an assessment that the client leads and the client delivers. There are providers out there that are encouraging contractors to do a review and provide it to you to sign off. I'd be very wary of that because clearly they've got an agenda, and the extent that that demonstrates reasonable care is questionable. By all means, involve the contractors predominantly in communication processes, but if they are answering some of the key employment status questions, just make sure that you're reviewing and you're fully comfortable with their responses to that. Okay, so roughly 50% using CEST, maybe more of the unknowns. I think HMRC have done a good job in encouraging people to use that. It is a free online tool, but you just need to make sure that you're not getting yourselves into difficulties by misunderstanding some of the questions in there. There's an example here around a client we've picked up recently who's now using Brookson's service. I'd assess everyone as outside because one of the questions in CEST asks about vehicle costs. They tick yes, contractors pay the vehicle costs on the basis that they put fuel in the vehicle to get to work. And it said everyone was outside. So that's a little bit dangerous. There are other providers out there that can help. Clearly Brookson is one of those, but there's other commercial tools in the market, and Paul will look at those briefly in a second. So I'll just whiz through these slides, conscious of time. This perhaps just summarises. This is a slide I've added because there's lots of things here to think around in terms of your workforce strategy. And it starts at that initial point when you go to market looking for some resource. I think now more than ever, you need to just pause a little bit. Is it a fixed term contract? Actually, a permanent employee I need? Do I need a contractor, or is there a statement of work provider that could provide this to me? I think in the past, people have gone out for a contractor straight away. I think it's time just to reassess. It's almost a decision tree at the front end. Also, it's critical that we start to centrally manage all off payroll resource to give us that visibility and MI, to make sure we can control our costs and manage this new risk. And don't forget about IR35. This is an ongoing requirement now. This reasonable care concept will continue beyond April 21 and now needs to form a permanent part of your strategy. And also, what approach you're going to take here. There's a new tax risk, but obviously there's a commercial risk here if you aren't able to support outside IR35 contracts. So a lot of the work we do with clients is actually, before we do that assessment, let's make sure we're in as best a position as we can to maximise the number of outside roles. And clearly, engagement with supply chain, compliance within that supply chain is now more important than ever. There will be new engagement models that come into the market, some of which may be perfectly fine, some of which may bring risk now to you because of the debt transfer. So management of that supply chain is now critical. So just jump on to the next slide, please, Paul. The next one after this one, sorry. So this is essentially a project plan example that we would work through with clients. So education is crucial here. And this is making sure stakeholders, yourselves, your agencies, also your contractors are aware of the changes, why they're happening, what you're doing in response to them, and your timescales. I think communication around that is crucial now, particularly for the contractors, to keep them on board and on the journey with you. The audit, I think, as we've learned, is probably the biggest challenge you guys perceived. Once you understand the number of contractors working through PSCs, it then requires the employment status by role. The approach we take is to report back. So our legal advisors will give you a red, amber, green output. That's our initial assessment. We then work really hard on the ambers to make sure we can get a final decision. And if there's a possibility for maximising the number of green outside roles, we will give you the advice to allow you to do that. Sometimes some of these changes might take months to embed into the business, so this isn't a quick win necessarily, but it starts to get you thinking around longer term, how can we move our organisation to support outside PSC working more, and therefore protect yourself from some of those commercial risks that come with the knee-jerk, tax-driven response. I guess ongoing support, then you need to probably think about how you're going to deal with some of those status disagreements. Have you got people in the organisation that could man an IR35 or status disagreement helpline? Do you need external support for that? And also don't forget about periodic audits and assessment of new roles. So I think that's the key point on this slide is there's lots of work to do between now and April, but it now needs to be embedded into a BAU process to make sure you continue to manage that risk. I guess the final point on there is thinking around visibility. So do you know all of the PSCs, all of the people who aren't PSCs now but could become PSCs in the future, and potentially those statement of work providers that may be hidden around your organisation? To what extent are they engaging with contractors, and is there any hidden risk in there? So it feels like there's certainly a system or a tech answer to that. That's certainly worth thinking about in terms of longer term planning. So I'll just hand back briefly to Paul now, just to talk through a couple of recent developments in our service.
Thanks so much, Matt. Yeah, so I suppose this slide was just to give you a bit of a demonstration over how Brookson Legal would help in terms of IR35 assessments, and over the past 12 months we've been improving our service, and the time afforded in the delay has allowed us to do that further. So we've launched our own IR35 portal, which allows for the remote audits to be done and the data collection to be done remotely any time of the day. I think the main benefit here is the ability for hiring managers to be able to complete the questionnaires relating to the working practices. All of the agency contracts or different template contracts that you've got can be stored within the portal. It provides a dashboard for the overview of your business by department and by contractor, and you can see where those reviews are up to, so you can see where those questionnaires are. So the questionnaire can be left as pending at any point, and if they need to go and get advice or speak to a different hiring manager or to HR in terms of how they can engage with the worker, then there's the ability to go back and review and complete those questionnaires. The dashboard also shows the IR35 status determinations that are coming out of there, and you'll see that there's normally 3 to start with. So the first one is inside of IR35 or outside of IR35. So clearly a straight determination based on the information that we've been given, where we tend to find that a lot fall into the pending status. And this is similar to something like if you try to use Assess tool, you tend to get about 20% of results that come back as an indeterminate status. The pending result there, it means that we're going to come back and give consultancy advice around that piece. And that's the key difference, I suppose, between using something like an online tool that uses algorithms to make a decision to using a law firm or a consultancy advice off the back of that. The tool is there to be able to manage the input of information from all your hiring managers. It's also there as a central repository for all of that information and status determination statements. So it's there as proof of your reasonable care if HMRC do ever come investigating IR35, and also a central repository for any reviews that you've done previously as well. So you've got to make sure that you can see that you're doing your ongoing due diligence. Another option, and in terms of the legislation, the 2 kind of key terminologies, I suppose, are hirer and fee payer. So the hirer, in terms of the business that's engaging with the worker, has the responsibility for assessing IR35 and making that status determination statement. And the fee payer, which could be you, if you're paying the workers and your PSCs, limited companies directly, or it could be a recruitment agency within your supply chain. Something else that within Brookson, as we've been working in this sector for a long time now, is that we've developed a fee payer solution where we can remove that risk. And that includes the onboarding of your workers once the search and selection has been done. Brookson don't get involved in the search and selection, so that would be down to your in-house recruitment teams or your agency, PSL and partners. But we can help with the onboarding and the worker engagement. There's the ability for a timesheet portal and integrated payment process and support throughout that. So at the moment, the responsibility for assessing IR35 sits with the client and the fee payer, whoever that is within the supply chain that you've got at the moment. Like I said, it could be you or the agency has the liability, where if we've done the IR35 reviews, then we can sit in there and completely remove that liability from you. I think this relates to one of the questions that someone asked actually, which what are the other available solutions out there, or what are the other solutions available compared to something like CEST? I think the main available solutions out there probably fall into 3 boxes, and you've got kind of tax consultancy firms that can offer you a lot of advice, guidance and support in the process, but are unlikely to get into the decision of making the decision for you. They're probably not going to review the contractual terms or go through the data collection. So it's going to probably give you a lot of the high level advice and strategy around how to deal with IR35, but maybe not the individual kind of tactical reviews that you're going to need. There are fully automated IR35 tools in the marketplace. CEST is the free one. There's also commercially available ones where you can pay for, but I think CEST is the free version that's there, and a number of you have intimated that you'd like to use that. I think the main issues with the automated online tools is that they don't give you any support or guidance on how you can change working practices. And I think what we found an awful lot of, and Alison can probably expand on this in terms of the way they went through the reviews, is that once you start speaking to a client and talking around how you can amend working practices, then there's the ability to legitimately move more contractors to an outside determination, where reviewing your current practices means that you're likely to get a higher proportion of inside of IR35 decisions. And obviously Brookson Legal, in terms of our IR35 service, provides all of that. The only part we don't do is the automated decision. Our portal is just there as a central repository and data collection tool, where it won't give any automated decisions out the back of that. I think Matt covered this as well. The changes aren't a one-off obligation. It's going to require a fundamental change to your strategy of how you engage with your workforce, and the change to your policies, processes, and procedures moving forward. The initial concern now is that you've got 6 months to assess your current contractors, whether you've got 5, 10, or 500. You've got to assess all of those current roles that you have. Post-April, you're going to need to assess them prior to giving that to your recruitment partner, whether that's an in-house recruitment team or external. The status determination statements on the role needs to have been done prior to you advertising the role, so the contractor can see whether that role is inside or outside, and they can see what their take-home pay is going to be based on that rate of pay as well. I'm going to pass you over to Alison at this point, and Alison is from DXC Technology. I'll leave her to introduce herself, but I'll come off at this time and allow you to speak to Alison.
Thanks, Paul. So good morning, everyone. I'm going to turn my video off. It's not a very good picture, quality picture, and just allow you to focus on the slides and hopefully listening to me. As I say, my name's Alison Ellis. I'm an HR business partner with DXC, and also was asked to pick up the project lead role for IR35. Just by way of background, DXC is an American multinational corporation. We've got approximately 8,000 employees in the UK and Ireland, and in excess of 500 contractors. We employ about 114,000 employees globally, and we're one of the world's leading independent end-to-end IT services companies, with around a $20 billion annual revenues, and supporting over 6,000 customers, private and public sector, over 70 countries. So that gives you an idea of us as an organisation. If I can just move on. So really just talking through how it worked for us in DXC. So we started looking at IR35 approximately September, October last year, 2019. I didn't get brought into the project until January of this year. Seeing some of the questions that have come up, and one of the things I think that wasn't clear was where responsibility sat for IR35 in the organisation, and also getting the right sponsorship at the executive level in the organisation. And for that reason, I think we stumbled to get started as a project. So it wasn't until January, just before Christmas, I was asked to pick up IR35. I didn't even know what IR35 was. I haven't been involved with contractors prior to this project at all, really focused on the permanent employees. So I'm by no means an expert on IR35, but I'm getting closer and closer to that as I work through. So as an organisation, we initially tried to manage the end-to-end process internally, and we considered banning the use of PSCs because I think that was considered that would be probably one of the easiest ways to minimise the risk. But it wasn't practical for us. We rely on a number of our contractors who've got niche skills, security clearances and experience. And the main deliverable I was given when I was asked to pick up the project was to ensure that there wasn't an impact on service to our clients. So at that time, we also thought about using the CES tool alongside some internally prepared questionnaires, but we soon realised that that was very complicated, and without a huge amount of care and management of that, we weren't going to meet the reasonable care requirement of the legislation, and that would have a negative impact on the business and increase our risk. So at that time, I think it was January of this year, we reached out and looked to see what providers were out there, and following a selection process, we selected Brookson to help us review the IR35 status of all of our contractors and help us manage the IR35 process. So Brookson helped us grouping the contractors by role. So where we had, and I think I mentioned, we had in excess, or we have still in excess of 500 contractors. So we grouped contractors by role, those with similar contracts, doing similar work on similar or on the same accounts within the business, and assess those together. And those were reviewed over approximately a 4-week window, which was a massive amount of pressure for us in the business, but also for Brookson, who I know were managing a lot of other providers, or working with a lot of other clients at the same time. At that point, we were late to the party, really. The fact that we were doing the assessments January, February, and even early March was too late. But we worked with Brookson, we got through the assessment process, we were doing daily calls to discuss priorities. Brookson were providing us with advice and support. We were dealing with questions in respect of amber determination, but also some of the managers were questioning whether people really were inside or outside. And so there was a lot of interaction between us, Brookson, and the managers to identify whether the assessments were correct and whether we could look at any business operating practices that could be changed. In addition to that, we were working with over 40 different agencies, suppliers, and Brookson helps support DXC in ensuring those contracts that were in place were an accurate reflection of the day-to-day working practice. With the help of and support of Brookson, we found that in some areas we could make adjustments, we could be more open to substitution, and we have seen some contractors exercise that right. But it has to be said, for us as an organisation, in most areas our position on substitution was reaffirmed, and that in that substitution wasn't an option. Likewise, we were able to offer more flexibility over when and where the services were performed. Obviously with COVID-19 now, we've got a lot more contractors working remotely, but that is only deemed to be a temporary arrangement for a lot of our clients. But similar to substitution, for those clients and accounts where security clearance is required or work is highly confidential or highly sensitive, those adjustments couldn't be made long term, and the contractors mainly fell inside IR35. Brookson then went on to help us with the actual determination statements for each contractors, detailing the statements and the supporting reasons behind those, to minimise the number of challenges. And we had started the challenge process in March, following the determinations going out, when the rug was pulled from under us and the legislation was delayed, which was incredibly frustrating given the work that had gone in at that time. But given the fact that it was delayed, it has allowed us to restart the project much earlier. So we kicked off June, July time. We've nearly completed all of our assessments. Any new assessments have been completed, and any of the assessments that were done earlier in the year, we've done with Brookson support, where they are reassessing a sample of those. We purposely started it earlier this year because we knew how much time and effort was involved, but we also want to minimise the risk to the business of disgruntled contractors potentially leaving the business and that having an impact on service. So, you know, we're heavily focused on getting the assessments correct, but we're also heavily focused on planning what we need to do with our contractors. Can we convert them to permanent? Can we remove the contractors and backfill with a permanent resource, or backfill with an internal resource? But we're working to ensure all our determinations are up to date and accurate ahead of the 2021 implementation date, and allowing ourselves plenty of time to deal with any challenges. That's it from me. Thanks very much indeed.